We've got to live together. That's not what we see, right? That's not what we see every day. That's not what we see on the news. That's not what we hear. We hear separation. But we all are here in unity because we know there is no separation. People used to say, oh, when you find somebody that you know, somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody, that you know, that there are 6 degrees of separation. There is no separation. When I look at you, I'm looking at me. You are a reflection of my own soul. Now, that is really hard to take. I want you to know, because there are things that I see that I wonder, is that me? Is that me? Labor Day is tomorrow. We've been celebrating this for 135 years in this country. And my friend Bev sent me this little cute thing I thought you might enjoy, especially for those of you who are still in the workplace. If a train station is where the train stops, what is a workstation? When I first came to Unity, the first experience I had, I was, well, not the first one, but one of the first ones at Unity Village, the first time I went there. I smelled gasoline, like car gasoline, fuel. And I, just got stronger and stronger, and I noticed that I seemed to be the only one smelling it. Nobody else seemed to turn around, but as I glanced around, I saw a man come in dressed in coveralls with lots of oil spots and grease spots on them. And he sat down on the other side of where I was sitting, and nobody paid attention. Where I grew up, he would have gotten a lot of attention. And I like that about Unity. That it doesn't matter what you look like, where you come from, who you are, we recognize the divinity in all of us. When I look at you, I look at me. So this drunk guy who hadn't been to church in years decided all of a sudden he needed to go to church. He had just had a night of just partying and drinking. And we walked in the church. Of course, he was all disheveled, hadn't had any sleep, and you could smell him a mile away. And a couple of people, the ladies, one lady turned up, put her finger on her nose, and one was fanning with her handkerchief from the odor, and he sat down next to them, and they were just appalled. Just appalled. This is not proper. And so as he listened to the minister speak, and as they were leaving, he thought the sermon was really good, and it really resonated with him. So he waited to shake the preacher's hand. He said, Reverend, I really liked what you had to say. The Reverend pulled him in close and said, whispered in his ear, before you come back, you need to talk to God about what's appropriate for you to wear and how you should look. And so he left, and he didn't understand what that meant. The next week, he liked the sermon, so he came back again, same thing. But he hadn't been drunk all night, so he didn't at least reek so much of alcohol. The same ladies saw him coming, and they moved over to the other side. He sat down, and he listened to the preacher, and he really liked the sermon. But he noticed when he was in line that the preacher sort of was turning his nose up at him and looking down at him out of the corner of his eye. And he sheepishly made his way over to shake the preacher's hand, and he pulled him in close. The preacher said, what did I tell you? Did you talk to God? He said, yes, I did. He said he wouldn't know. He's never been there. So, this is our mirror, right? This is our mirror. Whatever I see showing up outside of me, I'm looking at a mirror of my own soul. Now, those things I don't like may not be as active in me, but the potential is there. Rumi said, beyond ideas of right doing and wrongdoing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. There's a field. We're all in this together. So I want to talk to you today about loving your enemies. Last week I talked about love your neighbor. The scripture in Matthew says, love your neighbor as yourself. And there's that mirror again. Do I love myself? Because if I don't love myself, I can't love you. I have to first love myself. Do I love my enemies? And what does that mean? Who are your enemies? There was a woman at church little old elderly lady. She always sat way in the back, Mrs. Jones. And the preacher was speaking today about loving your enemies. And he said, if any of you, whoever in here does not have any enemies, I want you to come down front. Nobody came down front. In fact, most people scooted back. But little Miss Jones, with her little walker, came tootling down front. He said, Miss Jones, you don't have any enemies? She says, not anymore. They're all dead. So I venture to say that there's no one in here today who can say they don't have an enemy. Someone that really gets under your skin. Someone that just the sound of their voice is like nails on a chalkboard. Someone that just irritates you to no end. And it might be you. It just might be you. When Jesus was asked by the disciples, what is the greatest lesson? What is the greatest scripture? He says, you have heard it said to hate your enemies. You have heard it said to hate your enemies. But I tell you, love your enemies. Pray for those who are against you. Bless those who curse you. Be good to those who hate you. But the first part of that is the most important. But I say to you, you have heard that it is said. Well, what did they hear that it was said? Jesus was coming to give us life so that we may have abundant life. We may live it more abundantly. So how do we do that if we hate our enemies or anyone, if we hate ourselves? So what he was referring to is the Mosaic law, the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, crime and punishment. We still have Mosaic law. It creates order in some societies, but it was not meant to be taken literally. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot. You'll find those scripture in Exodus, Deuteronomy, and Leviticus in the Hebrew scriptures. What Jesus was saying was, you've heard that. Yes, that's true. That's the Mosaic law. That's law and order. But I came to replace and repeal. Or repeal and replace. Not to take away the law, but to fulfill the law. And to fulfill the law, I need to teach you about love. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love your enemies. And so you can think of enemies outside of yourself. That's easy. I don't like the black one, the red one, the white one, the blue one, the green one, the skinny one, the fat one, just like Millie just sang, right? Maybe those are my enemies, but the truth is, there is no enemy outside of you. Pogo, the cartoon, said, we have met the enemy and it is us. It is us. A good example of this can be found in the story of the farmer who every year won at the state fair for his prize-winning corn. And a news reporter noticed that he won every year for about 15 years and decided to do a story on this farmer. And so the reporter asked, how do you account for always having this prize-winning corn? With all the other farmers around, how do you end up winning every year? He said, well, I share my seed corn with them. The reporter was like, you share your prize-winning seed corn with your competition? That's like your enemies, right? With your competition? He said, yes. Well, explain that to me. And the farmer said, it's very simple. He said, when I plant my seed corn I plant good corn, the wind picks up and carries seeds to other farms. And my good corn, when I give them my seed corn, their corn they have the good corn too. And yes, they are in the same competition for the same award. But if I give them poor corn, if I give them deficient corn, then the wind is going to pick up and carry that seed corn back to my farm. It's the law of reciprocity, the law of compensation, the law of mind action, universal law that what I give returns to me. Pressed down, running together, shaken over in good measure. What I give, I get. If I give love, I get love. If I give hate, I get hate. A living example of that occurred here at this church a few years ago. Many of you may have heard of Westboro Baptist Church in Topeka, Kansas. And Fred Phelps, the minister, the late Fred Phelps, and his congregants would often picket various places where they felt that God hated. Now, though that subject and verb do not agree, God hates doesn't go together. But they believed that they knew what God believed, and so they would picket anything that was against their beliefs, whether it was abortion, same-sex marriage, any of those things. There was a memorial service being held here at the temple. And Fred Phelps' group was out there in droves, blocking the sidewalk, harassing anybody who was coming into the service, and really making a stew. The minister here, I'm not sure if it was Duke or if it was Max Lafser, but it's been a while. But the minister here saw what was happening. Now, could have gone out and raised his fist and said, "Get out of here. You don't belong here. Take your stuff somewhere else." But no, got a group of people together, and I believe some of the YOUers, and it was a really hot day. They took bottles of water and handed it out to the Westboro Baptist Church people. Not long after that, they dissipated, and the crowd dissipated, and they went away. That's an example of loving your enemies. Loving your enemies. When I was a little girl, and this story just came to me when I was working on this talk, there was a lady I was a part of the whole gentrification movement, if you know anything about that, when African Americans would buy homes that were previously occupied or in neighborhoods that were mostly white, the for sale signs of the white families would go up pretty quickly. And so when I was a little, many of the older neighbors, the neighbors who had been there before us, moved away, and there was one white neighbor on the corner. And Miss Dempsey was her name. She was a very old lady, and she was very mean. And I loved to ride my bike. I'd go flying down the street. I'd put those little balloons in my spokes and make it sound like a muffler, and I'd ride side saddle and ride on the handlebars. I can't even touch a bike today, but I could ride my bike. And I loved riding my bike, and we would all parade down, and when we get by Miss Dempsey, she would throw something, a pot of something at us. And we're not sure what it was, but she would have a pot of something and water, or whatever this was. So my dad hated Mrs. Dempsey. She got on his last nerve. He avoided her at all costs. The city was putting in new curves, and Miss Dempsey lived right on the corner, and so they were putting in new curves around her house, and they had a sign up saying, "Don't step," had rope around it and everything. One morning, about 6 o'clock, my mother heard, "Help, help, help." And she went to the door and looked down the street, and Miss Dempsey was in the concrete. So Mom, being the kind and loving person that she is, My dad was asleep because he worked nights. And she's, Grady, get up, get up, get up, Grady, get up, get up, get up. Miss Dempsey is down there and she's stuck in the concrete. Come, I'm not helping that old woman. He didn't say woman, but I'm not helping that woman. Grady, that's not the Christian way. Come on, Grady, I can't lift her. Come on, I'll go help you. We can get the neighbors. Daddy finally got out of bed. I don't want to do this. She deserves to be in that concrete. So anyway, so Mom pushes him out the door, and he goes and gets Mr. Taylor, who lived right next door, and they tugged and they pulled, and they got Miss Dempsey out of the concrete. I don't know how long it took them to wash that off of her feet, but it changed Miss Dempsey, and it changed me. I was just a kid, but it changed my whole attitude about Miss Dempsey. I began to see Miss Dempsey as a little girl who somewhere along the line had been hurt. I began to see Miss Dempsey as a human being, not an old witch that I thought she was. It just changed everything. We'd fly down the street on our bicycles. She wouldn't throw stuff at us. It's amazing how love can conquer hate. It is amazing. You've probably grown up at some point where maybe there were some mean kids, mean girls or mean boys, and they had their little clique, right? So you couldn't be a part of it, even though you wanted to be. You weren't good enough. You weren't smart enough. You weren't cute enough. You weren't skinny enough, fat enough, whatever. You weren't enough. And then you found out how, somewhere along the line, maybe as an adult, how to build a bridge over that little tiny circle. I think Edwin Markham says it best. And you may have heard this. It's one of my favorites. It's called Outwitted. He drew a circle that shut me out. Heretic, rebel, a thing to flout. But love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle that took him in. Now, when you're watching the news, or you see a neighbor that's doing something you don't like, or maybe there's someone you really can't, quote unquote, stand, think about the circle. Make a bigger circle. Bring them in. You don't even have to say anything. You can just think it. As one thinketh in their heart, so are they. That's the same thing with enemies. You may never even let anybody know that you have some kind of way of feeling about a certain person, but if you're thinking it in your heart, so are you. So are you. So I wanted to remind you today of the second part of the Sermon on the Mount, and that particular part of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. Love your enemies. Because sometimes it's easy to love somebody we like, right? It's easy to love, but who's our neighbor? Our neighbor is not just someone we like. We are all neighbors. We're all in the hood. This is the hood. That's the hood. There's the hood. It's everywhere. We are all neighbors. One of the greatest modern examples that I've seen of this loving your neighbor or loving your enemies is at the arraignment of Dylan Roof, the young man who killed the 9 prayer warriors during their prayer meeting at Mother Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. At his arraignment, several of the family members of the 9 that he killed, after they welcomed him in and prayed with him, said, I forgive you. I forgive you. Jesus demonstrated that same love your enemies when he was nailed to the cross. And the 2 thieves on either side, one saying, get me down from here, I didn't do anything, you can kill them, but don't kill me, I'm innocent. And the other who said, this man is innocent, pointing to Jesus, he shouldn't be here. Recognized the Christ in him and said, pray for me. And Jesus said, tonight you will be with me in paradise. And where is paradise? When we love our enemies unconditionally, we are in paradise. Love. That's what our window says. Love. That's all you need. That's the only commandment you ever need to know. Love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Be good to those who hate you. Pray for those who persecute you. So your take-home assignment today, if you want to expand your experience and live life more abundantly, find as many opportunities as you can to share the quality in you that you're looking for in someone else, especially with people who are even more difficult for you to love, because it's easy to love somebody you already like and love, but it really tests you when you have to stretch beyond that and love someone who you feel is unlovable. I invite you now to take this thought of loving yourself, loving your enemies, as we move into meditation.